quite a lead-in. I think the rest of my job for the next hour is to not screw that up and prove him wrong. So it's an event built around Doc Holliday, and I hope I'm not being a buzzkill by not talking about him. Can everyone hear me okay? No? Okay. Is that better? Yes. Okay. So this is centered around Doc Holliday. Hope I'm not disappointing anybody and not talking about him directly. But I really want to introduce you guys to a gentleman named Hugh McCrum. And for those of you who are really interested in Prescott history, you're going to want to know him if you don't. And for those of you who are just interested in Wild West history, this might be a man that you would want to sit down and have a beer with. Locally, he laid his footprints all around Prescott, Yavapai County, and as we will learn, most of the West. Unfortunately, his name is generally overlooked or completely unknown. So this presentation taps into research that I had done for the last 10 years. And I talked to someone about this at my table back there, and what I explained it as is I wasn't searching for 10 years, I was finding for 10 years. And so what I mean by that is that I was finding period documentation that built the story that eventually found the pages of the book. And I just kept finding stuff. It was like a vein of silver that never ran out. At a certain point, I started the project not with intention to write a book, but I had found so much information that the material dictated to me that I was going to write a book. And so my goal then was to give a voice to these numerable records that hadn't been used in telling Tombstone's story before, certainly not the birdcages, and offer it to people who wanted to know. Within the course of that 10 years, I spent about 5 of it. There were a lot of people that moved in and out of the storyline that was really important to the building's existence, its operations for 10 years as a theater, and certainly its preservation. I broke away for about 5 years and did about 5 years of genealogical and ancestral work, building the stories of the people that were integral to its story, hoping to find things that could contribute to our greater understanding. It sounds ridiculous to say, but that number of people ended up being about 200. And within those 200 people, this man stood out to me. And hopefully you'll agree when we get done talking. We could summarize Hugh McCrum and in one sentence say, oh, he was the guy that owned the Birdcage Theater and the Palace Saloon in whole or in part for roughly 20 years. That would be the main tagline if you wanted to boil it down to one sentence. Though his name is generally not associated with the Birdcage, he owned it for 20 years, which covers the majority of its operational period. And so you have to say, with a resume like that, what else does he have to offer? What else about his life is important? I'm here to share this with you. To start his story, we go back to Carmody, Ireland, where he was born in 1836. His family went back in that area several generations. It's a pretty predictable existence from generation to generation. It's a very agricultural area. Most people are either working in farming or they're working in nearby Belfast in their shipbuilding industry. Very sparsely populated. He was the 8th of 9 children born. And 6 of the 9 were born within 7 years of each other. And so when you have families that are generally inhabiting these small stone huts with thatched roofs, you've got very close proximity amongst the family. Not a lot of economic potential. Most people, there was not a great diversity in their affluence. Culture, traditions, music, very important to the community there. Life centered around the Presbyterian Church, where Hugh and a lot of his siblings were baptized. And it was a fairly, you would say, modest, but stable upbringing. And a lot of this changed in 1845. There's 2 main pivotal periods in Hugh McCrum's life that really defines his life story. And one happens in 1845. Perhaps some of you had family that was affected by the Irish Potato Famine. Of course, you have widespread famine across Ireland, United Kingdom, and in Western Europe. And it wasn't just the famine that caused issues. It was all the political, social, and financial unrest that had followed. It really created a hellacious, one of the darkest periods in that geographic region. The McCrums somehow kind of stood through this for 5 years. From 1845 to 1852, you had 1 million people from Ireland die. You had another 2 million actually leave the country. Over this 7-year period, it equated to roughly 25% of the nation's entire population were gone. And in 1850, the McCrums decided to do the same. They jumped on a boat, the SS Aberdeen, and landed in New York. Hugh McCrum was 13 years old. He arrived with his 3 brothers and his 2 parents. His teenage years, it's not real clear exactly what he was doing, though records do show that his parents eventually settled in Brooklyn, lived the rest of their lives there, as did a couple of his brothers, mainly the men of the family taking manufacturing jobs. As for McCrum, by 1860, we find him in the gold fields in California. This is a huge change from where he came from. Economic stagnation. Now he's in one of the areas of the world with the greatest opportunity that in human history. He's living in a small miners' colony called Pine Grove, California. It's like 125 miles east of San Francisco. There he is a self-declared miner, living in a small shack by himself, on the census record declaring that his possessions amounted to $0. This is where it gets interesting. That's 1860. From 1862 to 1872, he elevates himself. He's owning businesses in San Francisco. He follows the boom to Virginia City. He's establishing businesses in Idaho, Montana. And when you look at the period of time in which he is moving, he is clearly following the flow of information of where the greatest booms are going. And that really defines the next 4 decades of his life. He's moving around in these various communities. He also marries. His wife is also very enterprising. She owns a millinery and a few other businesses. They don't have any kids, but they seem to be on the same page with their entrepreneurial goals. And so from 1872, he takes it up a notch. And he gets hired on and actually becomes a business partner with this man, James Monroe Goey. And you would say that without digging through McCrum's entire financial records, for him to buy into a partnership, that he must have done well for himself the previous 10 years. And Goey himself was extremely successful. He had come to California closer to the beginning of the gold rush and had established a series of retail stores with a lot of clients in the upper Sierra Nevadas and in Oregon. And he is also a very intensely invested capitalist. So he's not just a liquor distributor and a retail goods distributor. He's also taking that money and kind of parlaying it into other opportunities that are presenting themselves as the West is growing and expanding. As we find out from McCrum's future, he takes this template of capitalistic endeavors and applies it to his own life. With Goey sinking a lot of his funds into these capitalistic endeavors, he decides to leave the business, and McCrum takes on a partner, John Sroof. And so they changed the name of the firm, Sroof and McCrum. He's a very strategic partner, a man who I suspect he probably came to know through a lot of his travels as the traveling agent for J.M. Goey. John Sroof is 10 years older. He has, at this point of their partnership, 20 years of experience in liquor distributorships. And they were both very focused. They both came to California at about the same time. John Sroof was an Ohio native. He got there a little bit sooner. And they were both following a lot of those patterns from California to Virginia City. And so they seemed very well like-minded. But John Sroof, not only did he bring the experience, but he also had a family. You have Hugh McCrum, who is loving his travels, and I think a partnership with a man who has experience, similar goals, but also a family that makes him more suitable for staying behind the desk, seemed to work very well for the two. Now, if you notice the last 4 slides, we went from a stone cottage in Ireland to the photo you're seeing here, which is their established distribution center and main offices in the belly of San Francisco's business district. Those 4 slides cover 25 years. And I think more than anything, maybe in our own lives, very hard to appreciate the difference from going from a very dark place that was fraught with death and lack of opportunity to a place like America and then the American West during the gold rush, where you have infinite opportunity. It's a contrast that I think is really hard to explain and definitely worth noticing. I think McCrum's life is interesting to follow just for that reason, because it really explains what America and what the West was all about for a lot of people who came. All the millions that left Ireland and all of those that left other areas of Europe at the same time. So I mentioned that when I do biographies, I will dig through as much primary source material as I can. One of the things that really stood out to me when researching Hugh McCrum is how much this guy traveled around. People in the West were more apt to travel than people in the East. It's just the nature of getting there and moving around, feeling your way out. And I had done plenty of biographical work on other people, but this guy was nuts. Like, it was unbelievable. So I decided to put together a travel log for Hugh McCrum. And this is tracking his movements, when and where and how often. So how do we track this? Well, newspapers, for one, were very helpful. You had, it was customary for when people would sign into hotels, this would be advertised in the paper. You also had transportation notices. These were even more helpful because they noted arrivals and departures. They would also tell you the method of transportation, whether it's ship, train, or stagecoach. And it would also tell you generally the actual railroad that it was on or the actual stage line proprietor that brought them there. And then, of course, for people of prominence, local press would like to advertise the presence of significant people moving around, Hugh McCrum being one of them. It makes it a little bit easier tracking someone like him around. It also gives you a little bit of a hint as to what his standing was and what the press thought of him. There's other resources too. He was involved in a lot of other dealings, so if he's present in a mining office to record a claim, or if he's in court answering for a case, there's a lot of other supplemental ways to track him around. What I found was pretty staggering. Before I show the next slide, I want to show a couple of quotes. In tracking, in collecting all of these resources, I found a couple of really good quotes that I think really punctuate. And also note with these quotes, they're from different geographic areas. So it's not like he had one friend at a newspaper just churning out a bunch of positive stuff about him. The Gold Hill Daily News in Nevada said he is well versed in the geography of the Pacific Coast, having visited every town and hamlet west of the Rocky Mountains. The Eureka Daily Sentinel said he takes tours of the entire coast from southwest Texas to British Columbia, Canada, on behalf of the interest of his firm. The Salt Lake City Tribune said he was the oldest liquor merchant on the coast. He knows everybody from Colorado to the Pacific. He has traveled more miles and done more hard work than any man on the coast. That quote comes from 1881, after he'd only been traveling basically only halfway through his career. And then our very own Journal Minor said Hugh went through experiences in traveling that would have worn out an ordinary man years ago. So I compiled all this. What does it look like? What you're seeing here is a spreadsheet that I compiled all of those resources. Each line represents Hugh McCrum arriving somewhere or leaving somewhere. He did this for 40 years. So this document has a lot of value. There's a lot of really great conclusions that come out of it. The first and most obvious is that that's a lot of traveling. What I did beyond that is I added up all the distances roughly between the places he was coming and going. And keep in mind, there's plenty of communities, boomtown communities, that he would have been to that did not have newspapers yet. But if you add up the distance between these hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of travel notices, it roughly equates to about 1 million miles of traveling in a 4-decade period, most of which was done before railroad infrastructure was available in the Western United States. And so one of the reasons that he stood out to me when I was doing all these biographies, there's so many interesting people that had their hands in the birdcage, that factored into its story. But I thought if I could have a beer with one person, it would be this guy, because he saw everything. The entire expansion of the West from the Civil War until the turn of the century. I don't know if it's a valid argument, but it certainly could be, that possibly nobody saw more of the American West on the ground than Hugh McCrum. So beyond that, I wanted to know, what was the life really like? Okay, so you can put a point on a map. draw a point, another point on the map and say he traveled from Salt Lake to Eureka, Nevada. Okay. But I wanted to know, what does this actually look like? You know, for people even in your own lives who travel a lot. It's not just that you flew from one city to the next. There's always an experience. There's delays, there's problems with the plane, there's people sitting next to you trying to have stupid conversations. There's a reality there that it doesn't come across in these types of resources. So what I try to do, when I try to present, and even in the book, I don't just try to present a bunch of facts. Right? These are real events that happen, and so you try to research it enough to where it crosses over from individual points of information into a real living story. And in an effort to do that with Hugh McCrum's travels, I did a lot of research on the actual stage routes and travel routes that he went on. And I wish I could make an entire presentation about this alone. A couple of highlights. I'll just pass these on. We see stagecoach robberies typically in movies and TV shows and in fiction books. This was an absolute epidemic in the 1870s, particularly in the years that Hugh McCrum was traveling. You have long distances between towns. They're very sparsely policed. You have all the towns that people are coming and going from are there because they have some degree of economic wealth. This is a recipe for disaster, and it actually happened. After a period of time, these robbers would stop the coach, take things from all the passengers, crack open the safe box, added precautions, just like with our phones and our banks, that they tried to avert those types of attempts. And so one of the things they did, they started adding extra layers of protection to these safe boxes. Well, to combat that, the robbers started bringing in powder to try to blow them open. I found one instance where these robbers, who clearly didn't know how much powder to use, blew up the entire coach. I found another quick-witted driver who averted an entire stagecoach robbery by telling the robbers that the passengers were smallpox victims going to the next town. There's a whole gamut of these, and it's really incredible, and they do coincide with where Hugh McCrum was. I would say even if he miraculously went through all of this travel and never was the victim of a robbery, the constant threat of it would have absolutely been ever present. It was absolutely part of his lifestyle. In being fair, I did find quite a few of these robberies that were done by polite people. I found one case where a man went through every single passenger, lined them up, let the women stay in the coach, went through all of the luggage, took everything from everybody, gave a $5 bill to the youngest boy so he could get breakfast at the next stage stop. So to kind of put a bow on this part of Hugh McCrum's life, I want to read just a very short excerpt from my book. Aside from persistent fears of Indian tax, both real and imagined, Hugh's rigorous Western travels presented other threats, such as highwaymen who preyed on travel routes. There were also dangers presented by long, empty stretches where horses and transportation equipment could fail. Many stage roads were crudely built, sometimes hugging mountainsides, on narrow passes and claustrophobic canyons. When danger wasn't looming, coach passengers were assaulted by the elements. Heat, cold, snow, rain, dust, cramped interiors, rude passengers, and careless drivers. None of it stopped Hugh McCrum. While many travelers hated stage travel or were afraid of it, he loved it. His willingness to hit the dusty, dirty, and dangerous road made him the perfect business counterpart for the grounded family man like John Sroufe. Now, what's really incredible about this is I tracked his company and his movements around. I discovered that they actually hired regional traveling agents to represent their firm. He didn't even have to do any of this. He was significantly older than most of the agents. It was a young man's sport, yet he was still out there. And most of the agents covered smaller geographic regions. I don't like to jump to conclusions as a researcher, but it seems to me that he didn't have to be doing this and did it only because he loved it. And I'll go a step further to say that it really contrasted the upbringing he had and maybe the life that he saw his older brothers lead and his father lead, and knowing that he had such incredible opportunity that he just sunk his teeth into it. That's how it looks to me. So I mentioned that we learn a lot from his travel log. What else do we learn? I mentioned earlier that when I research an event or a building or a person, you can find individual plot points to say, okay, this person was born here. They got a job here. They married so-and-so. They died. Here's where their grave is. I like to research it to the point where those individual information points become so well colored and filled in that a real person emerges out of it. I don't want to just know where they lived. I want to know them. And so luckily, in digging through all of his travels, a lot of this stuff started to bubble to the surface. A couple of his personality traits: he was a sporting man. He was always game for, it didn't matter what it was. I found one instance, this reads like a dime store novel. He's at the Baldwin Hotel in San Francisco. He gets into heated words with a billiard player, this hotshot billiard player there, and like gentlemen, they decide to put on their finest suits, meet at 6 a.m., and have it out with guns in the morning. Now people are congregating, sticking their heads out from behind the buildings, hoping to catch a look and miss a bullet. And this whole thing wraps up comically, where they're wearing nice, expensive silken hats with their suits. They both ruin each other's hats and decide to bury the hatchet at sucking whiskey at the bar. In another instance, he very well publicized wager he made with a man that he couldn't ride a horse from San Francisco to Tucson in 25 days. It's this kind of stuff that he was always engaging in. And being Irish, and perhaps stereotypically, he loved alcohol. He wasn't just a whiskey drummer, he was a connoisseur. I found one instance. He owned several properties in San Francisco. He was taking a buggy from one of his properties to his home. He was so drunk, he got into an accident. The horses ran him over. He almost died. And then there's other instances here, but just to cap this off, his wife, who I'd mentioned, they kind of ran around sharing their entrepreneurial goals. She divorced him twice. The first time, her declared reason was for habitual drunkenness. Now, his first wife might not agree, but I did find that he was extremely well liked. I'm going to read another series of quotes. The Ogden Daily Junction, this is in Utah, says, "Mac is a jovial fellow and a thorough businessman. He has a good name among all his acquaintances." The Los Angeles Star called him a gentleman of intelligence who carries upon his face impressive truthfulness and reliability. The Eureka Daily Sentinel says Hugh is one of the jolliest fellows in all the country, thoroughly reliable. And when he promises to forward you the best liquor in San Francisco, you can bet your life he'll do it. The Gold Hill Daily News said McCrum is a whole team in himself and has a large circle of friends in this section of Nevada. In Reno, they also said Hugh is as well known in Nevada as sagebrush and as popular as the liquor he sells. A little-known newspaper in Tombstone, called the Daily Tombstone, said he was one of the best-known commercial drummers on the Pacific Coast. And the Phoenix Gazette echoed that, saying he has traveled through the mining regions of the coast for 30 years, and none are better known. Now, I think these personality skills, these traits that he had, would have served him equally in distributing his liquor, creating relationships that would then advance his business. But he's also using these same skills and these same relationships to gather intel as he's traveling the West. Yes, his first priority seems to be to sell liquor, but he's really, like James Monroe Gowie, who he worked with 10 years earlier, he is an addicted capitalist. So in tracking him around, you find that he's investing in literally every state and territory west of the Rockies. I could go through to track the paper trail of Hugh McCrum and his partner John Sroof and properties that they owned. It would take years and years to track it all down. Some highlights here: you see California's Cliff House, which is a prominent landmark in 19th century San Francisco. He had major mines in Arizona, which we're going to talk about. He had the trading post at Fort Bowie when Geronimo was held captive there. Everywhere, saloons in Oregon, businesses in Idaho. He had ranches. It's very clear that his priority is to actually find opportunities and invest in them, get in the game. His travels, in my view, were not necessarily just to sell liquor, but it was to serve this cause. And he always seemed in the know. Now, as he traveled around, what's very interesting, you also know about one of the things that the travel log proves is that while he's traveling through a lot of areas of the country, there's something about Arizona that stands out to him more than any other place. Excuse me. So his first trip into the territory was in 1872. This is after he was hired, or rather became a partner with Gowie. According to McCrum, at the return of his trip, he said that he had visited the principal towns and places of importance in Arizona. He also returned, he left Arizona. Again, there's no rail service anywhere in Arizona at this point. He exits going west to Los Angeles and talks to a couple of Los Angeles Star reporters about what he encountered there. And this is what they reported on. They said he reports that Apaches rally and carry on their murderous attacks against peaceable citizens. Mr. McCrum says that traveling in the territory, except with a strong and well-armed escort, is exceedingly hazardous, and he is compelled to do most of his traveling under the cover of night to prevent being waylaid by the Apaches. The enemy has every advantage on the traveler, as they are thoroughly familiar with every portion of the country and are liable to spring upon you at any time, and their concealments behind rocks and in the mountain gorges. This doesn't sound like a great welcoming committee, and I wouldn't have thought that he would go back, but he did. Over the next 30 years, McCrum and in part Sroof become so invested in Arizona that they become some of the highest taxpayers in every county and developed city in Arizona, despite not having offices there or not living there. Now, one of the places I want to highlight, obviously relevant to the book, and this is kind of how I became familiar with him initially, is that he made several trips to Tombstone. I tracked 13 between 1879 and 1891. This period of time really covers the entire boom-bust cycle of Tombstone. I would suspect that there are gaps in newspapers through this period. I would have to believe, based on his pattern of travel, he actually made more than 13. But I found just on his third trip, which happened in April of 1880, the Nugget already was calling him the well-known liquor man from San Francisco. I think that's probably pretty suggestive that not only was he making more trips than I'm aware of, but he was doing a lot of business and very quickly made a lot of associations there. One of the more interesting trips that he makes is in March of 1882. This is a period now 3 months after the birdcage had been established. There's a long story, the ongoing lethal, legal, and financial struggle that was required just to get that building standing. But it paid off. The gentleman who built it, his name was William James Hutchinson, and very well liked around town, had a lot of friends. His business was extremely well patronized, was taking in tens of thousands of dollars every month. I found some financial records that had really helped bear this out. Unexpectedly, when Hugh McCrum comes to town in March of 1882, he initiates a mortgage with Hugh McCrum. So he's asking for money, even though he's making a lot of money. And despite the fact that he went through all these long-standing struggles to build the building, he actually mortgages the building for this money, which is confusing that he needs to begin with. Now, the terms of the loan are pretty simple. It's a $2,500 loan to be paid back in 6 months with 1% interest. Shouldn't be a problem because the theater is really cranking. In looking at financials across Tombstone, without having everybody's balance sheet, I can say that it was one of the more profitable businesses in 1882. So you think paying it back would be no problem. 6 months went by, he only paid back $160. More than a year goes by, he's only paid back about 10%. And finally, Sroof and McCrum take action. This ultimately, to speed the story up, what you're looking at here on the left is the original mortgage agreement between the building's owner and John Sroof and Hugh McCrum. On the right, after Billy Hutchinson was summoned to court to actually answer for the unpaid mortgage, he decided to not show up. Now, there's a lot of really interesting financials that go along with this, and without getting too much off into a birdcage tangent, it's pretty clear that the owners of the building, despite taking in a lot of money, were really in financial hot water. Today is August 16th, right? Today's August 16th?
Yep.
Yeah.
It's birthday.
That's true. On this day in 1883, the owner of the birdcage announced to the public that the building was going to be closing. On that same day, he was fined for a small local infraction, which amounted to $5. Most police court infractions, the guilty party could pay the fine or spend that amount of days in jail. After it was all said and done, not only did Billy Hutchinson not pay back the loan, but he didn't even have the $5 to pay his infraction and spent the time in jail. In a last-ditch effort to save the building, he actually engaged in a chattel mortgage. So he took all the contents of the building, and the paperwork outlines all of the materials inside the building, the scenery, the glasses that people were taking their drinks out of, the silverware, the chairs, the chandeliers, the actual bar. And he put this up for $500. He didn't pay that back either and lost everything that was used to run the birdcage. And this really is what crumbles his tenure as birdcage proprietor and shifts it into the next series of owners. Now, what was supposed to just be a 6-month loan for John Sroof and Hugh McCrum ended up being a 20-year era of owning the business into the 20th century. And while that's kind of tragic because the theater was actually run very well, as Tombstone hits its economic lull, the fact that the building is in the hands of deep-pocketed businessmen like John Sroof and Hugh McCrum is probably one of the reasons that it's still standing. Of course, we come to Prescott. Now, I mentioned that his first likely trip to Prescott came in 1872 when he claimed that he visited all the principal towns and places of importance in the territory. But he returned less than 2 years later to Prescott, and it was almost his last. Again, with no rail service, he takes wheeled conveyances over to Tucson, up to Phoenix. He's riding a buckboard with a traveling party. They cross the Salt River. It flips in the winter flooding that's happening, and they all almost die. Somehow he gets through it, and it doesn't dissuade him. Not the Apaches, not almost dying in the river. He keeps coming. By 1885, he had made so many trips to the area, he invested so heavily into the area that the newspapers made routine mentions of him as if he was an old friend. The Journal-Miner called him, or said of him, that he has an army of friends in Prescott. Now, 1885 is also an interesting year for Hugh McCrum. He takes an entire tour of the West trying to survey where are things happening? Where can I invest my capital? He returns from that and he reports what he called unprecedented dull times. Now, contrast that with an interview. This is one of my favorite clippings that I found. It's an interview with Hugh McCrum by the San Francisco Chronicle. So in light of all of these unprecedented dull times, Hugh McCrum is still seeing something in Yavapai County. This is what he said shortly after. He said, "I never saw a district turn out better, and I have frequently visited all the mining camps on the Pacific Coast in all stages of development. A large number of prospects have recently been opened, and they all prove to be rich. I look for a big crowd of people in the district. You have no idea how many people from the Rocky Mountains engaged in silver mining are now invested in Arizona." He kind of doubled down his investment in Yavapai County and in Prescott. The Journal-Miner commented on that and said that Hugh McCrum is a firm believer in the future of Yavapai's mineral wealth and is one of the most energetic capitalists on the coast. There's a lot of ways to measure his impact. Money invested, number of businesses he owned, number of friends that he had, how much time he spent here. But we take a look at a few of his investment highlights. Again, it would take too long to kind of cover it all. But he, as far as mines are concerned, he had invested in the Silverbelt, Gladstone, and McCabe mines, and now these are all kind of connected on a somewhat similar ledge, but they're spread out by quite a distance. The Silverbelt, which was a modestly producing mine, McCrum ended up throwing a lot of capital into, and within a few years it had produced $250,000 in ore. The Gladstone mine he ended up selling for $150,000. And you can actually find national coverage in 1901 when he sold the Gladstone for $750,000. Now, the McCabe mine was his, at least in my research, and I know there's investments that he had that I still have not found, but it is his biggest capitalistic success. It also made a really big impact. The town of McCabe itself really harbored, at least during his ownership, more than 50 families that had its own post office. But what may be even a bigger impact to the area was the creation of what was called the McCrum Sampling and Milling Company. So you had, at this time, this is 1893, he had, there were a lot of well-producing mines in the area. The problem is, you know, anyone who knows things about silver mining, you don't pull the ore out, you don't pull raw silver out, it has to be reduced and processed. There were no processing centers anywhere near, so this required mine owners to take the ore and transport it to places that could. This added on a significant cost. The added cost was so significant that it stagnated any actual mining in these otherwise well-producing mines. So McCrum saw this as an opportunity. He made a lot of money off this. He put in what was a fairly state-of-the-art reduction mill. And yes, he made money off it, but it really made a huge impact on the economy of the area because it put all these mines to work. It put all the miners to work. It was really a win-win for everyone involved. The Florence Enterprise made a comment on this. They said McCrum's mill will afford the people of the district an opportunity to work mines at a profit that were until now lying comparatively idle. Now, beyond mines, he also owned several businesses. Certainly, the gem of Prescott might be considered the Palace Saloon. He, along with John Sroof, owned the lots and the building at different times, to different degrees. There's been a lot of really great work. I couldn't possibly stand up here and try to do the history of that building justice knowing Brad Courtney's in the room. There's a lot of material that he's written on that anyway. But what I would like to take this opportunity is create another, and I know Brad likes this, another Tombstone Prescott connection. We know through the records that of the 3 lots that that McCrum had owned, one of them was Robert Brow. And so when the fire of 1900 hit, initial reports said that McCrum was intending on actually rebuilding. Whether that was accurate or not, we'll leave it up to the journalistic standards of the day to determine. As we find out, though, I tend to think it is, as we find out later, McCrum's health is really failing at this point. We'll talk about that in a minute. But he opts not to rebuild, but to sell the lot. And the man he sells the particular palace lot to is Robert Brow. When I first came across this, the name Robert Brow really stuck out to me. It rang a light bulb in my head. I'm like, where have I seen this guy before? So I went through my files, and I made quite a discovery. Back at the Birdcage in 1881, Billy Hutchinson, who had established it, really wanted to uphold a high standard of entertainment. He went to great lengths to travel, to go to the great entertainment centers, to go to the best theaters in these towns, Denver, San Francisco, El Paso, and recruit the best entertainers he could. When he opened the theater in December of 1881, he went to San Francisco. He brought back 16 performers from their top 2 venues in the city. I don't know how he was able to do it, but convincing someone to leave San Francisco and come down to the Mexican border for an unproven theater, I think would be a pretty tough sales pitch. But he was able to do it. Now, in theater employment structure, there is a head coach, if you will, and that is the stage manager. This is generally an experienced entertainer, someone who's got either ownership or management experience, and he hires on a gentleman named Harry Lorraine. And Harry Lorraine comes with his wife, Clara. They also bring along their 6-year-old daughter. The theater opens on Christmas Eve, found records to prove that that was the day that it opened. Hours after the first performances, Harry, who's in his early 30s, unexpectedly dies. So his wife Clara, now Harry, a lot of people had actually known Harry in Tombstone. A lot of people came together to provide financial support, to be there enthusiastically support her grieving. She stayed until the spring, eventually moved to Prescott and married Robert Brow. Now, this is a period of time they end up marrying. Now, what's kind of tragic about it is that Clara, 7 years to the day after Harry died, Christmas Day, 1888, passes away unexpectedly at the age of 36. Now, this covers the period of time in which Hugh McCrum and Robert Brow do have business connections. And I don't have any way to prove this, but I'm left with questions, always. Searching for answers in research, even if you find them, always cultivates 20 new questions. And the one question that came from this was, did Hugh McCrum know that his business associate's wife was a former performer at the theater that he still owned? We'll never know. So we turn to the final chapter of Hugh McCrum. I mentioned earlier that there were 2 very pivotal periods in Hugh McCrum's life. The first one was the Irish Potato Famine. And the second one, now that first major point brought a lot of opportunity to the life of Hugh McCrum. The second pivotal point virtually took all of that opportunity away. First of all, I had mentioned earlier that his wife divorced him twice. In 1895, she finally had enough. The paperwork that she had filed, she described a scenario in which they got into a heated argument. Hugh McCrum went after her with a cane. He left the house and didn't come back for 2 years. No record of what they were arguing about. But if we consult the travel log, we know Hugh McCrum was coming back to San Francisco constantly, but he was staying at the finest hotels in town. So after 2 years of him not coming back, she filed on the grounds of desertion, and the divorce was granted. She only lived, Emma was her name. And Emma died just 21 months later. And interestingly, you look through her probate record and you find that her estate was worth very, very little, which suggests that she didn't really get much out of the divorce. Though she did live long enough to watch Hugh McCrum get remarried, which he did just 2 months after the divorce was final. which suggests he might have had guests at his hotel rooms in San Francisco. What's also interesting about the travel log is that when mentions of his travel was published in newspapers, it was general that if a man was traveling with his family or his wife, it would actually say that. Now, in the 30 years that Emma and Hugh were married, she's almost never traveling with him. I found 1 or 2 instances where she's traveling with him. After he gets married to his second wife, Helen, he's almost never traveling without her. So if we can draw conclusions on that, it's very suggestive that his romantic life is on the rise. On the downside, it seems as at the same period of time, his health is really breaking down. I have a picture here of a number of noted health resorts. Health resorts were kind of a kick in the late 1800s, early 1900s. Hot springs, curative powers of waters, these sorts of things. And instead of McCrum traveling around to boom towns, dodging stagecoach robbers, he's now sunning his feet at these health resorts. And he's traveling with his wife. We also found he's suffering from a number of things. He has rheumatism. I also kind of speculate that the years of drinking, the rigors of travel are problematic, but he's also really suffering from tuberculosis. On New Year's Day, 1892, he dissolved officially his partnership with John Sroufe. The San Francisco Chronicle printed this. They said McCrum withdrew from the liquor firm because of ill health. Since then, he has given his attention to mining in Arizona and has been making his headquarters at Prescott. So I had, in the book I had, it's so irresistible when you find all this information, you want to shoehorn it all into the book. It's how do you not share this stuff with people? But you have to make cuts and trims and so forth. There was a little section here from the book that didn't make it in, which I'd like to read. And this talks about this period of his life where he's really suffering and going to these hot springs. Hugh started visiting hot springs as early as May 1887, fully believing in what he called curative powers of the waters. He visits to such resorts increased as time went on, and ultimately he traded the dusty Wild West for the safe and silent springs and beach resorts of the Central Coast. Much of his travel was done with his second wife, Helen, something he almost never did with his first wife. Hugh never again sold liquor outside of the saloons that he still owned. Aside from the health resorts, he also spent time at his home base in Mill Valley, north of San Francisco, and satisfied his capitalistic addictions by buying and selling many properties throughout the city, and tending to his holdings in Prescott. His wife settled into the comforts of affluence, social groups, and heading up the event coordination of the Mill Valley Congregational Church. Meanwhile, bad health accelerated his Prescott investment, which ultimately facilitated some of his biggest victories as a capitalist. In May 1901, Hugh McCrum, accompanied with his wife, visited Arizona for the last time, 29 years after his first harrowing trip across the territory, where he complained of Apache attacks, insufficient military protection, and made ore discoveries that began his decades-long love affair with Arizona. While he closed out most of his Prescott holdings before his death, he filed his will in only 2 locations, his home in San Francisco and Prescott. Hugh McCrum died on June 27, 1902 at his home, 2319 California Street in San Francisco. His official cause of death was tuberculosis. To his last days, he was a passionate capitalist and opportunity seeker. Just 2 months before his death, he was still dealing in Cochise County mines in southeastern Arizona with his old partner, John Sroufe, the transaction being reported in the town's newspaper where his name was still fresh on the minds of many. In the end, his estate was worth nearly $1 million. As a final nod to his popularity in Arizona, his death was published heavily in newspapers across the territory. Appropriately, our very own Journal Minor published their thoughts July 2nd, 1902. Hugh McCrum was well known all over the territory. He was a large-hearted, generous, and genial man, and went through experiences in traveling for his firm that would have worn out an ordinary man years ago. He traveled for 25 years during the days when travel was confined mostly to staging, and had a host of friends all over the Pacific coast. I had mentioned earlier that the story of the birdcage unavoidably goes through a lot of different people who all contributed to its real story. As they exit the story, You learn a lot about them and why they're important to the story, but you never really find out what happens to them. I, for that reason, decided to include an epilogue in the back of the book that puts a nice literary bow on the story. And for the people that you got to know through the story and get a little invested in, you know what happened to them. Some of their endings are really positive, others not so much. I included Hugh McCrum in that epilogue. I have a slightly expanded version here that I thought the audience here would enjoy, so I'll read that. Hugh's upbringing in a modest working-class household, jam-packed with siblings, restricted by the limited opportunities of his homeland, seems to have impacted the choices he made in America. Everything he grew up with contrasted his life as an adult. His cramped family lifestyle as a child was countered by adulthood spent as a solo traveling businessman in the vastness of the West. He distanced himself from family geographically, if not emotionally. His will left very little to his numerable family members. Only his younger sister was considered to receive any of his estate. Even on the day his dad's body was lowered into a grave in Brooklyn's Cypress Hill Cemetery in 1872, McCrum was busy rambling across the Arizona border for the first time, encountering the threats of Apaches and experiencing the thrill of a new business frontier that would define his later years. Ironically, there's very little to suggest he worked to maintain his family relationships, at the same time building a network of hundreds of deep connections with strangers between the Rockies and the Pacific. His destiny was a fairy tale the generations of Irish ancestors before him could have never imagined. He traveled the American West, an area of land 30 times greater than that of his entire native country. He prospered, making 1,000 times more per year than the average working American. Proceeds from Prescott's McCabe mine alone was more than the average man would have made in 50 years of labor. He seemed to never tire of these privileges and may have been acutely aware of how his life in America was so different than what it would have been in Ireland. Instead of life as a limited income laborer, nursing an aging and aching body, he had beautiful residences in one of the great cities of the world, a carriage hauled by well-groomed horses, and endless opportunities, a lifestyle of joy propelled by capitalistic pursuits, adventurous travels, and all the finest whiskey and bourbon an Irishman could drink. It's ironic to think that the Great Famine that starved millions of his countrymen and tormented millions more was the catalyst to such unimaginable, prosperous life. His approach to life can be a template for our own endeavors. He seized life and courted passionate pursuits as a rule, and seemingly never wasted a day to complacency. Historically speaking, his life is a true portal to the very heart of the West during its most storied and opportune time. He lived in the most deeply romantic, highly fantasized period of the West, saw more than perhaps anyone who lived, dodged the dangers of the stage robbers who lurked along the roadsides, and took all the stories to the grave for us only to wonder at now. While many chapters of his life are now entombed with his body in California, his legacy can still be appreciated here in Arizona. The celebrated Birdcage Theater, Tombstone's most iconic original building, now has its true history revealed after 140 years of mythology. During McCrum's 20-year ownership, the building was sheltered under his financial safeguard during a time of Tombstone's history that claimed dozens of priceless historic structures under the weight of its collapsing economy. Without Hugh McCrum, this national treasure would likely not be standing today. And of course, Prescott's reincarnated Palace Saloon opens its doors to Montezuma Street, just as its predecessor did when Hugh McCrum last left the building. While we can't sit at the same bar that McCrum bellied up to, we can raise a glass of whiskey in his honor and pay homage to the man who blazed a trail across the Atlantic, all across the West, and by virtue of his energies, the landmark buildings we celebrate today. Thank you.